Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. History 1. The secret gathering where nuns danced naked around a sacred bone. During a particularly long winter, I found shelter in a silent convent nestled among mist-covered hills, where the bells rang not out of devotion, but from habit. The windows were tall and narrow, like eyes that refused to cry, and the scent of melted wax mingled with that of old parchment and still warm rye bread. I was young, and my presence there had less to do with faith, and more to do with survival. In that season of silence and prayer, I uncovered something no prayer dared name, a secret that seemed to whisper through the stones. The walls of the convent were cold to the touch, yet carried murmurs that never ceased. It was in the library, where time dozed between forgotten hymns, that I noticed a locked cupboard, as forgotten as an unadorned grave. Sister Mariette, very old and almost invisible to the world, called me one afternoon. Her voice was like a candle about to flicker out. Not everything that was silenced has ceased to echo. With trembling hands, she gave me the key and walked away. Inside the cupboard, among recipes for ointments and confessions faded by time, there was a handwritten account stitched in dark, steady ink of a night when the rules bent like knees before the unexplainable. For a moment I hesitated. The silence around me felt like it was watching. There were no exact dates, no full names, only symbols and veiled phrases, as if the writer knew she would be read by eyes far too attentive. But there it was, mention of a secret ceremony, celebrated not under the altar's blessing, but beneath the dim light of the full moon, in an abandoned wing of the convent. The nuns would gather at midnight, wrapped in heavy cloaks that slowly slipped down onto the cold stone floor. At the center rested an object wrapped in sacred linen, a femur, ancient and polished like ivory touched by time, the bone of a forgotten martyr, whose name had been erased, but whose silence still resounded. The account did not speak of scandal. It held an almost tender tone. It said the nuns' feet touched the ground like leaves in the wind, moving in slow circles, accompanied by a chant without words, made only of breath, muffled laughter, and broken sighs. They did not dance out of rebellion, but out of longing for a time before rules, before guilt. It was a night just for them, where body, faith, and mystery intertwined like ribbons around a forgotten altar. The author, unnamed, described how, around the sacred bone, they lit small candles made of hardened honey and herbs gathered in silence at dusk. The scent that filled the air was sweet and earthy, as if the forest itself had been distilled into warm wax. There was no priest, no sermon, only women in silence, offering their bodies to time as living prayers. Some wept softly, others smiled with closed eyes, as if rediscovering something long lost, perhaps themselves. It was not a rite of mockery, nor heresy. It was, according to the manuscript, a reunion with the part of God that lives in instinct. That night, there was no talk of sin, only of presence. The femur, they said, was not a symbol of death, but of persistence. A fragment of someone who had resisted being forgotten, and now guided the living to do the same. Some sisters said they felt a gentle tingling while dancing, as if invisible hands rested upon their shoulders. Others swore the air grew warmer, as if the martyr's spirit embraced them. At the end of the dance, one of them would lie down beside the bone, offering her dreams in silence. The others would cover her with a linen cloak and leave her there until the rooster's first crow. In the morning she would rise in silence, her gaze serene, and no vow seemed heavy upon her shoulders. Then the routine would resume, prayers, work, silence. But in their eyes a discreet glow lingered, like embers beneath ashes. Over time, the manuscript said, the practice grew rare. New mothers came, stricter, more fearful. Some pages of the account were torn, others were stained with what looked like dark wax or tears. But the author ended with a phrase I never forgot. What is danced with the heart is never undone, not by time nor by guilt. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply left, among fragile pages, the memory of a rite that joined flesh and faith without shame. Years later, already an adult and far from the convent, I visited a remote village where elderly women placed lit candles on their windowsills during the full moon. One of them offered me dream root tea and between warm sips and muffled laughter whispered, "There are dances no one teaches anymore, yet the body still remembers." She didn't explain what she meant, and I didn't ask. And perhaps there was no need. Some answers are born only in silence. That night, as I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the scent of burnt honey, of the soft echo of bare feet brushing stone, and of a pale bone resting at the center of a circle of faint light. Sometimes I wonder if it was all real, or merely the desire to find beauty, even in the forbidden. But then I remember the texture of the parchment, the firmness of the ink stitched into near eternity, and Sister Mariette's trembling hands entrusting me with something greater than words. And I think perhaps the truth lies not in the fact, but in the memory, and that some memories, even when hidden behind locked cupboards and nameless nights, continue to dance, slowly, silently, eternally. Even now, when the wind blows a certain way and the candles flicker for no reason, I feel that ancient presence, not as a ghost, but like a forgotten song. The memory of those nuns dancing under the moon, their bare feet on cold stone, does not frighten me. On the contrary, it brings me peace, as if I knew that even in the strictest places there was room for tenderness, for mystery, and for freedom. Perhaps all traditions hold their secret little deviations, spaces where the soul breathes, far from watchful eyes, where faith mingles with instinct and with longing. That dance, veiled in time, was never erased, only kept, like so many other stories that live between the cracks of the past. And on this quiet night, in sharing that memory with you, I feel it dance again, not among the stones of the convent, but within the soft thoughts of someone now at rest. History 2. Why some monks were buried upside down. During a particularly long winter, I lived for a time in an old stone monastery, nestled among damp hills and crooked trees that seemed to whisper to one another at dusk. I had been taken in as a scribe, still young, with fingers too shaky for the precision the task demanded, but with ears attentive enough to notice what the echoes left unsaid. And it was there, where every stone held a secret and silence seemed to have its own voice, that I discovered a rare kind of burial, one in which the body was given to the earth head down. The library, steeped in the scent of parchment, burnt candles and damp wood, was where I spent my days. But the nights told another story. In the darkness, broken only by creaking beams and the whisper of wind through the cracks, I would hear murmurs. Not from the monks, but from the stone itself, heavy with centuries and silence. It was through this constant murmur that I came to know a story few dared to repeat. It wasn't written in the records, nor did it appear in the books I so diligently copied. It surfaced only when the hearth was down to its last embers, and the elder monks, with dark wine in hand, let memories slip like smoke. They spoke of certain burials performed at night, with no bell, no chant, no name carved in stone. Graves dug hastily and covered before sunrise, but one detail remained constant across all the versions. The bodies were laid upside down, as if the earth itself felt shame in receiving them. At the time, I didn't grasp the weight of this gesture. It seemed no more than a grim legend, told to keep novices in line. But as winters passed and my work led me to the monastery's most shadowed archives, dusty chests, torn maps, margins filled with trembling script, I began to see there was more truth than the monks let on. In one such chest, wrapped in cloth smelling of camphor and forgetting, I found an old journal. It bore no name. Its pages spoke of wayward brothers who had been corrected in death, so their souls would know they were never again to face the heavens. The official explanation was always the same: heresy. But between the lines and behind averted glances, one heard whispers of more human things. Monks who had loved beyond what was permitted. Brothers who spent their nights not in prayer, but drawing salt circles or keeping black feathers hidden in boxes. Others simply questioned too much. They looked at the stars with more curiosity than faith. For them, there was no public square or stake. Only the inverted grave, anonymity and eternity, with their feet turned to the sky and their heads bound to darkness. One especially cold night, old brother Elias, who could barely see but heard better than anyone, called me to the cloister. He had spent the day in silence. Seeing me with a blanket over my shoulders and a book in my lap, he said simply, "Come, I want to show you something not found on any map." He led me to a small walled garden where dry lavender swayed beneath the moonlight. There, among the stones, one of them was sunken in the center. Elias pointed with wrinkled fingers. He tried to teach too much. He was buried there, upside down. Said he could hear God's breath in the tides, not just the Mass. He said it with sadness in his eyes, as one remembering a friend, not a heretic. After that night, I began to notice patterns. Certain corners of the cemetery were avoided. Graves overgrown with leaves and time bore subtle marks, no cross, no name, and in one case, a circle etched along the stone's edge. I asked quietly to other monks. Their answers ranged from uneasy laughter to absolute silence. One of them, too young to hide his discomfort, murmured, "Not all were made to pray facing the sky." After that, he avoided meeting my eyes. There was an unease around those secret burials, something even the passing seasons could not wash away. At times, during night vigils, when the wind curled through the chapel's narrow windows, I wondered if the upside-down buried felt the inversion, if the weight of the earth on their feet, instead of their chest, made any difference in their eternal sleep. I remembered what a well-traveled brother once told me. In distant lands, the bodies of the condemned were flipped to confuse the soul, to send it to hell, or lose it along the way. But what haunted me most was the silence. Monks were so diligent in their record, in margins, codices, psalms, but those graves had no names, no notation, as if the monastery wished to forget or hide. In time, I came to see those spaces not as curses, but as confessions. The soil seemed to hold them with sorrow, like an old man ashamed of a decision made in youth. Perhaps those who dug the graves did so under orders, but with tears in their eyes and trembling hands. After all, burying a brother is grief. Turning him upside down, a punishment for the living. On a misty morning, I was assigned to clean the lower crypts, a damp place where wax flickered even without wind. There, among worn tombs, I found a niche sealed with more mortar than necessary, as if to ensure it would never be opened. The brother with me simply murmured, "Only the forgotten sleep there." But he didn't say it with disdain. His voice carried pity. And then I understood. Perhaps not all those buried upside down were guilty. Perhaps they were simply different. I spent many winters in that monastery. The silence of certain corridors taught me more than many sermons. I never wrote about this in the records. Who was I to contradict the centuries? But at times, when walking past the flower beds where violets grew on their own, I would drop a small stone onto a nameless grave, a silent offering, a recognition. I imagined that maybe, somewhere between heaven and earth, that gesture would be noticed, not by the saints, but by souls whose faith had once been mistaken for fault. Years passed, and my departure from the monastery came quietly, like all things done with care within those walls. I carried few belongings, a handful of manuscripts, a spoon carved by a departed brother, and the habit that shielded me from the wind and from memory. Even far away, in distant villages, the memories of that grey hillside follow me, especially on the stillest nights when wind howls through crooked rooftops and the fire in the hearth dances as if it remembers something it cannot say. Now, with more white than brown in my hair, I still sit by the window at dusk, holding a warm cup between tired hands. And I think of them, not with fear, but with tenderness. Perhaps the world was too harsh on those monks. Perhaps they loved more than they were allowed, questioned more than they should, or dreamed of things their time could not bear. I like to imagine that in some gentler realm than this, their souls were carefully turned right side up. That angels, with firm and compassionate hands, took the time to straighten what man's haste had reversed. And if not, if they still lie upside down beneath the cold earth, I hope they found comfort in the dark, like someone sleeping, embraced by their own silence. For there is a certain dignity in remaining whole, even when the world insists on bending you. Sometimes being buried upside down is simply another way of saying, I do not belong to your order, but I belong to my own. And that, to me, always sounded like a prayer. Not one that echoes through frozen dawns, but one belonging to those who were born to gaze at the sky, even if through roots. So if one day you visit an old cemetery and come upon a forgotten grave, nameless, covered in moss and violets, you might be standing before one of those burials that history tried to hide, and if as you pass, you place a small stone or whisper a gentle prayer, perhaps you will help turn a soul right side up. Not through punishment, but through welcome. Because in the end, we all carry something the world would call strange, and all we want is a place to rest in peace. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be light, and may the world, despite its faults, learn to redeem itself, even if slowly, like stones leaning toward the sun. History 3. The medieval town that arose solely to serve a bishop's carnal desires. Many years ago, during a pale winter when the snow seemed to fall heavier than usual, I was taken in by an old scribe at the Abbey of Vaux-sur-Roche. His ink-stained fingers and a beard dusted with breadcrumbs gave him the look of a distracted hermit. Yet his eyes held something alert, almost mischievous, as if guarding stories he'd rather not tell. It was on one of those silent nights, when the northern wind whistled through the cloister's cracks, that he drew close to the fire, wrapped in a worn mantle, and murmured, "Have you ever heard of a village that doesn't appear on any map? A place hidden among hills, where the bells don't call for mass, but for desire?" I merely shook my head, and he, after a long sip of warm wine, began to recall. It was called Lubricia. According to him, it sprang up as herbs do between stones, in a forgotten corner between damp valleys and hills, where the church bells dared not ring. A village made of mist and murmurs, built in silence and sustained by a bishop whose name was wrapped in censorship. No one knew exactly where the funding came from, only that the stones of the houses were smooth, the stained glass vivid like summer fruit, and the paths always strewn with dried petals. The air was filled with fragrances, sweet, spicy, exotic, as if they sprang from the earth itself. There, far from Rome and from prying eyes, that man in heavy robes allowed himself to be merely flesh, and perhaps for a moment he felt truly alive. They said the bells of Lubricia didn't announce sermons, but baths. By the banks of a mineral stream, they built steaming bathhouses, fed by pinewood fires and silences paid for with gold. The walls were hung with tapestries embroidered not with martyrs, but with reclining figures beneath golden stars. There the bishop, whose name the scribe never spoke, walked among the steam and whispers, the cross swaying gently over his chest, but his eyes searching for something more earthly, more tender, more surrendered. Lubricia had no ordinary villagers. Its inhabitants came from afar, Fairground musicians, masseurs with fingers like flowing water, women with eyes rimmed in charcoal who danced as if gliding. All seemed chosen for an intimate performance, every gesture rehearsed to please a single spectator. The bishop, between sips of spiced wine and glazed bowls of dried grapes, claimed he blessed the village with the spirit of divine pleasure, a phrase that drew quiet laughter down the halls, but was never questioned. At this point, the old scribe paused. He stared into the fire as if trying to decipher a memory in the flames. Then, in a softer voice, he said that Lubricia was sustained not only by coin, but by silence. Those who knew of its existence, nobles, travelers, the occasional indulgent abbot, received favors, appointments, or counterfeit relics, all to keep the village out of the chronicles. It was a dream within time, he murmured, a place that pretended to be shadow, just to remain desire. And so it went on for years, surviving plagues, wars, and even the church itself, which deep down knew everything. But as long as the gold kept coming, faith could wait. Like all dreams, Lubricia began to unravel at the edges. First came the rumors. A drunken monk, a scribe who recognized a tapestry. The scandal spread like mold, quiet, persistent. When the bishop fell ill with fever, those who once protected him fell silent. And into that power vacuum came the torches. According to the scribe, the village was burned in a single night without warning, without mercy. The flowers turned to ash, the perfumes to smoke. The dancers fled into the hills, their hair still smelling of lavender. And then, only the breeze remained. No one wept. Or if they did, it was in silence, just as they had lived. The bishop was taken back to the cathedral he came from, dressed in liturgical garments that cloaked a body more familiar with satin than with hair shirts. They say that when he was buried, his coffin gave off a sweet scent, like that of burned flowers. Lubricia vanished from the maps. But not all fire consumes everything. Some secrets survive in the cracks, said the scribe with an enigmatic smile. He told me that, years later, he recognized a melody at a fair, played by a lutenist too young and too precise. And on a rainy night at an inn, he saw an old tapestry, the same golden stars, now used as a curtain. Fragments of a village that was never meant to be, but still whispered somehow. Over time I realized that Lubricia wasn't just a place. It was an idea, a reflection of something hidden beneath cassocks and silence. In taverns, I heard tales of a village where the wine was always sweet. In libraries, redacted passages spoke of a garden of delight among the hills. And once, in a ruined chapel, I saw a fresco blackened with soot, a serene face surrounded by steam and lilies. Perhaps all of it is fiction, or perhaps not. To me, Lubricia is real as the scent of a memory you can't quite name, like a secret that continues to whisper even after centuries. The old scribe died the following winter. When they cleaned his cell, they found a small folded tapestry inside a codex, golden stars, and at the center, the silhouette of a village wreathed in mist. I kept that tapestry for many years. Not for its worth, but for what it seemed to hold, a thick silence that asked for no explanation. Sometimes, on the calmest nights, I spread it across the bed, and I let my mind drift back to Lubricia, that village that perhaps never existed, or existed only for eyes attentive enough to see it. Now, old myself, I know that some stories do not survive because they are told, but because they are felt. Did Lubricia burn? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was never built of stone. Perhaps it still lingers in the muffled sighs of archives, in the unlit corners of monasteries. Perhaps it was scandal, or simply desire, poorly dressed in faith. Whatever the case, I like to believe that, among ruins covered in moss and oak roots, its echoes still rest. Invisible to maps, but not to the hearts that once knew it. And if one day you walk an old path and smell something in the air you cannot name, perhaps, just perhaps, you are passing through the ashes of Lubricia. Good night, traveler. May your dreams be peaceful, and may the secrets of the past drift gently through the pages of your sleep. History 4. The bizarre custom of keeping enemies' genitals as trophies. During a particularly harsh season, I lived with an old uncle in an isolated fortress in the east, where the wind sang through the stone windows like ancient laments, and the hearth's fire felt like the only living thing after sunset. He was a man of few words and meticulous habits, always oiling his boots before snowfall, sharpening his blade even on peaceful days. But what impressed me most wasn't his routine, but the small oak box, locked with 2 keys and hidden beneath loose floorboards in his room. He never opened it in daylight, and perhaps it was better that way. It was on a night when the firewood cracked loudly and stories flowed more freely than wine that he told me what he kept inside. His eyes, clouded with age, turned from the flame for a moment. He said it was a trophy from cruel times, and that men, when deprived of wisdom and consumed by pride, turn even the most intimate parts of war into symbols. They were genitals, he confessed in a hushed voice, of defeated enemies, cut with a short knife and wrapped in cloth with coarse salt. Some were left to dry in the sun, others were soaked in vinegar and kept as if they were medals. I inherited the silence in that moment. I only listened to the crackling fire and the wind groaning against the weathered window pane. My uncle, with fingers rough like bark, took a slow sip from his mug and went on. He said he wasn't the only one to adopt such a custom. Many knights, especially those who fought in distant campaigns on the eastern frontiers or in land disputes, had come to see it as a silent warning. A charm of virility, some would say. A reminder of what one risked when crossing certain men, others claimed. He mentioned a specific troop from a county long forgotten by modern maps, whose banners bore serpents coiled around columns, and whose leaders displayed their trophies tied to their belts or hanging in tents like macabre collections. Even allies felt uneasy in their presence. There was something feverish in those men's eyes, something military glory alone couldn't explain. For many, it was a hunger for power. But my uncle believed it was something deeper, the terrible fear of disappearing into a common death, of becoming just another nameless body under the earth. While we were clearing the cellar for winter, I found a moldy scroll among ropes and sacks of rye. In hurried handwriting, someone described a duel between 2 noble rivals, ending with a gesture that chilled even the crows in the trees. The victor raised not a sword, but the severed part of his opponent, as if it were a banner. The text described with eerie calm the drying ritual, the use of herbs for preservation, and even a small red cord braided around it. I never knew if the scroll was real or just a provocation from bored soldiers. But the image stuck with me, clinging to memory like the scent of damp hay on cold mornings. My uncle, when younger, had served in an elite squad, the ones who cleared the woods before the army advanced. He said that one night after a skirmish, a man returned with blood-spattered clothes and an empty smile. He pulled from his leather sack a fresh trophy, tied it to his belt, and slept with it beside him, like a dog sleeps with a bone. No one said a word, not out of agreement, but because back then, silence was the safest currency in the madness. War, my uncle whispered, makes us believe that some shames are medals. And when we return home, it's the silence that weighs heavier than the blade. Some said the custom originated with northern tribes, where warriors painted their bodies with blood and believed virility could be stolen and kept. Others spoke of desert chiefs who stuffed the genitals of defeated foes, but my uncle found such theories too exotic. For him, it all came from the same place as many other atrocities, fear. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of being forgotten. It was a brutal way to affirm presence, to ensure that even in madness, someone would remember you existed. The oak box was never opened in front of me, but one night, close to his death, my uncle called me to his room. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls like echoes of old ghosts. He pulled from beneath the bed a bundle wrapped in aged linen. He opened it gently. What I saw wasn't as horrifying as I'd feared. It was small, shriveled, wrapped in a braided straw cord. Beside it, a faded emblem, a crow pecking at a rose. "He wasn't my enemy," he said. "He was my brother." Battle had placed them on opposite sides. I couldn't bury him, so I took something of him with me, and I never fought again. We remained in silence for a long time. The candle burned slowly, as if reluctant to witness what passed between us. My uncle's words, as dry as the trophy he had kept, weighed heavier than the stone walls of the fortress. There was no pride in his voice. No clear regret either, only a deep fatigue from someone who had carried a story too long without knowing how to lay it down. That trophy wasn't a symbol of glory, but of interrupted mourning. A fragment of the past that had never found peace. Over time, I heard of other soldiers who kept similar objects. Some called them charms, others curses. It was said that those who bore them could never father children, as if the memory of what was taken prevented life from taking root. Superstition or not, it was rare to see an old fighter laughing on a porch. Many died alone, their chests filled with dried memories and nightmares wrapped in cloth. It was said that not even rats gnawed on such things, as if time respected or feared certain horrors. Among them was a knight named Arnaud, from the outskirts of Montreseau. They said his chamber was filled with such trophies, hanging from the beams like grotesque chimes. When the wind blew, they made a hollow sound like forgotten prayers. Arnaud never smiled. He only drank in silence, facing the hearth. They claimed he was never wounded in battle, but at night he was defeated by memories. He died in his sleep, and all his trophies vanished before the burial. For a long time I avoided thinking about it. War always leaves traces, on roads, on walls, in calloused hands. But few notice the marks it leaves on the soul. Sometimes I wonder how many of these objects still lie hidden in attics or buried with their owners, sealed in silence. No songs were written for them. And yet, perhaps these fragments of horror reveal more about human fragility than any monument ever could. Years after my uncle's death, I returned to the fortress, now in ruins, ivy climbing the towers, moss covering the stone steps. Time had quieted the corridors, but as I stepped into his room, I felt the air thick, filled with a warm and sorrowful presence. The floorboards creaked, as if they recognized my return. I found the box. It was empty. Only a piece of cloth embroidered with the crow and the rose. I took it with me, not as a memento of a dark custom, but as the memory of a man torn between duty and longing. That night, I camped beside the crumbled wall. The sky was clear, and the stars watched in silence. I thought of what had been lost, and of what we still carry, often without knowing. Some inherit castles, others scars. My uncle left me a difficult story, but also a lesson that even the most barbaric gestures, when looked at closely, carry the pain of those who committed them. Now, as I recall all of this, I realize how some horrors endure not out of pride, but because no one knew where to bury them. And sometimes, all a story needs to finally rest is to be heard. Not to glorify what was done, but to understand the shadows that fear casts upon the human heart. If there's anything I carry with me, it's this. Even the strangest memories hold a spark of truth, and every pain, when told with gentleness, finds some form of peace. And now, as the night deepens outside and the world grows quiet, I let this story rest too. May it sleep with you, like a soft breeze among dry leaves. Good night. and sleep well. History 5. The Manuscript of Albrecht. In the quiet corridors of the ancient abbey where I spent my youthful winters, there was a legend we dared not speak aloud. It told of a book, a volume bound in leather, darkened by time, sealed with red wax, kept far from the main library. It was stored in the cold cellar, where mold grew like sacred moss. They called it the Manuscript of Albrecht, though no one knew for certain whether the name belonged to its author, or to some presence that had whispered it into being. The elder monks would fold their arms at the slightest question, and they'd say, in hushed tones, that the final chapter was not meant for the living. It was that warning which, one night as wind battered the stained glass windows, sparked my curiosity. In those days, I was but a copyist. Ink-stained fingers, a hunched back, and dreams far too restless for a novice. I enjoyed digging through forgotten archives, breathing in the scent of aging paper, deciphering marginal notes left by trembling hands from centuries past. It was there, among letters of penance and treatises on the soul, that I found the manuscript, wrapped in coarse linen, sealed with old wax. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from that quiet fascination known only to fools and to the love-struck. I broke the seal gently, like one opening a fragile memory. The first pages were written in Latin, adorned with pigments now faded, yet still beautiful, as if painted by hands that knew more of the beyond than the now. They were visions of hell, yes, but not made of fire or monsters. They were empty hallways whispering names, mirrors that did not reflect, faces surfacing at the edge of dreams. Nothing screamed, everything murmured, and perhaps for that very reason, it was more disturbing. With each page, the air around me seemed to change, as though the room was breathing with me. The final chapter was different, sewn to the rest with a red ceremonial thread. It bore an inscription in ancient Greek that translated roughly as, "He who sees all forgets who he is." I took a deep breath and undid the knot. There were no words at first, only an image, something between a map and a vision. A circle divided into 7 parts, with symbols that seemed to shift each time I blinked. Scattered notes spoke of echoes, forgotten names, and the pain of remembering what was never lived. Then the sentences began. But they told no story. They described sensations, the anguish of walking through a world that no longer exists, the sound of voices no one should hear, the taste of regret in mouths that never spoke. I reached the middle of the chapter, and then something stopped me. My eyes burned. A hum began to swell in my head, like bells ringing beneath the ground. When I awoke, I was on the cold floor. The manuscript lay closed beside me, and a candle had burned all the way down. For days, I wasn't the same. The words returned in dreams, not as sentences, but as scents, textures, memories, and a name I didn't recognize, yet somehow knew was mine. Shortly after, the abbot summoned me. He asked nothing, only looked at my hands, as though searching them for signs of madness or remorse, and he said simply, "Some doors were made to remain closed, brother." After that, the manuscript vanished. No one admitted to removing it, but all seemed relieved, like after a storm that passes without saying why it came. In time, I understood. The danger of the book lay not in what it said, but in what it awakened. 2 monks who dared to finish it were never the same. One fell into silence. The other left one morning and never returned. I like to think he went in search of answers, or to forget the ones he found. The years passed, and with them, my youth. I became librarian, keeper of words, and of the silences between them. I never saw the manuscript of Albrecht again, but its weight never left me. At times, I found traces, a repeated symbol, a strange scrawl in the margins, as if the book never needed to be present to be read. It only required that someone think of it. One day, a man in dark robes visited me. He claimed to be a collector of rare texts, but his eyes held that hunger true scholars do not carry. He asked for books that stir the soul. I denied knowing any such thing. He smiled, not in disbelief, but in understanding. He left an old coin on the table from a kingdom that never existed and whispered, "Some writings do not vanish, they simply change their skin." From then on, certain books would disappear at night and return by morning, with fresh dust on their covers. One of those nights I reopened an old codex on monastic visions. As I flipped through, I noticed a page that felt too thick. Carefully, I separated the layers, and there it was, a fragment. 3 lines in the same trembling script as the final chapter. There is no veil that hides what the heart has seen. Memory is the truest punishment. I sat in the hallway of the library with hot tea and lit candles, not out of fear the evil might escape, but in case someone might call to it. The following spring, a novice arrived, curious, bright, eyes that shimmered with the same fascination I once knew. One day, I found him leafing through an old journal with a mention of the manuscript. He smiled and asked, "Do you believe a book can see who reads it?" I nodded gently, but inside I trembled. It was already too late. That night I dreamed of the cellar. All the candles were lit, the manuscript open like a living flower. Around it, shadows with sunken eyes and mouths sewn shut. I ran to the library. There he was, the novice, asleep, lips murmuring in a dream. Beside him a loose page, 3 lines, written in my own handwriting, that I didn't remember writing. Knowledge is a bridge, but not all should cross. I woke the boy gently. He said nothing, only looked at me with something in his eyes I could never name, and I understood. The manuscript had touched him, but spared him. After that, we never spoke of it again. The novice continued his studies, became a monk, left for a distant abbey where they say, books whisper when the wind passes, and I grew old, among chamomile tea, creaking wood, and pages I still watch over. I kept what I lived like one keeps an old secret, not out of fear, but out of care. Now, sitting by the window where the sun warms the stone, I feel that part of me still walks those cold corridors, with a lamp in one hand, and the weight of the unspeakable in the other. Some nights, I think I hear pages turning, far from here, as if someone somewhere had chosen to defy the seal once again. In those moments I pray, not for fear of evil, but in hope that the reader is ready, for the manuscript of Albrecht does not command, it only waits, and when the soul arrives, too thirsty, it whispers. May your pages be soft tonight, and may the silence between the words be your shelter. Good night. History 6. The White Fortress. I'm not certain whether it was autumn or spring when I first visited the White Hill of Virel, one of those places that seem to exist only in whispers and in maps too old to be trusted. The road that led me there was lined with willows, and the wind blew with the sound of lament, as if flipping through forgotten pages of a story no one dared to tell anymore. I was young, curious, and a little weary of the world, seeking rest and silence, and so it was, beneath a dull sky and the scent of faded lavender, that I found the faint outlines of what they called the White Fortress. Something about it, though, still seemed to pulse beneath the stone. It was a small castle compared to those told of in tales of kings and heroes, but something in its towers, in the way they stood pale against the sky, made the heart beat slower, as if listening. Its stones bore not the grey tones common to the region, but a milky, almost translucent pallor that shimmered sadly at sunset. The elders in the village claimed its walls had not been raised with water, as one would expect, but with something more intimate, more human, mother's milk. And it was there, between brittle ivy and lingering shadows, that the mystery began. It was said that the king who ordered its construction was a man of obsessive faith and even more fevered visions, a sovereign convinced that purity could be embedded in stone, that innocence could be forged like iron if only the right ingredient were used. And so, according to old accounts, women from distant villages were summoned, not by choice, but by decree. Their hands did not lift stones, but their bodies in silence fed the construction with the milk once meant for their children. 100, 200, perhaps more, no one truly knew. Some arrived with hollow eyes, others wept softly at sunset, as the lime was mixed with the most intimate substance of their lives. Over time, the castle became known for its color, a dull white, faintly pearlescent like bones beneath mist. It was beautiful in its own way, but carried an unsettling beauty, the kind that makes one furrow their brow before knowing why. Villagers called it the Fortress of Lament, claiming that on the dampest nights a distant crying could be heard from the stones, a muffled sound, like that of a hungry infant no one comforts. And it wasn't rare for travelers to wake with small ulcers on their chests, or the eerie sense of being watched by newly opened eyes. A place that slept with its eyes open, the old miller used to say. At the top of the northern tower was a room no one could stay in for more than 3 nights. The bed would creak on its own at dusk, and the tapestries frayed without a touch. A young monk's apprentice who once spent the night there swore he heard whispers from the walls, as if the mortar itself preserved the size of its donors. When he came down, his hair was white as curdled milk, and he never smiled again. They say he became a hermit and lived on dry bread and poorly whispered prayers. But what struck me most was the scent. Even after centuries, a sweet aroma lingered in the air around the castle. Nothing rotten, nothing offensive. A nearly maternal fragrance, like warm milk left by a windowsill on a rainy afternoon. It was a scent that tightened the chest, as if reminding us of something we never lived, but still missed. Animals avoided the place, and children cried when approaching, even without knowing the stories. It was as if something there whispered directly to the heart, and the heart, as ancient as it is, always recognizes what was made with pain. The king, curiously, never lived there. He had the castle built with all the solemnity of an offering, yet remained distant, as if sensing something had gone wrong, or too right. They say he visited only once, at the end of the construction. He touched the walls with his fingertips, turned as pale as the stones, and said nothing. He simply turned and ordered the gates to be sealed, and so the castle remained, complete, imposing, but empty, a monument not to glory, but to silent sacrifice. The people called it involuntary penance, the monks sanctified madness, and the ghosts, well, the ghosts only wept. Years passed, the weeds grew, the windows darkened with soot, and the king's name was forgotten. But the castle endured. The white mortar seemed made of bone and memory. Some tried to live there. A bankrupt count once sought refuge during a war. He brought servants, new tapestries, even a priest to bless the rooms. On the first night, 3 servants fled. On the second, the priest fell silent and began drawing circles on the floor with breadcrumbs. On the third, the count left without taking anything, not even his rings, as if understanding that some places do not wish to be inhabited, only remembered. That's why, when I arrived on that foggy afternoon, I wasn't seeking shelter. I only wanted to see, with my own eyes, whether the rumors bore weight. The entrance was half hidden by old ivy, and the iron gate, though closed, wasn't locked. I pushed with effort, and it opened with a creak that echoed for far too long. As I stepped across the threshold, the air shifted. It felt like entering a place where time dozed, where even shadows were thick like drowsy honey. Inside, everything was surprisingly bare, not of dust, but of excess. No tapestries, no furniture, no ornaments, only white stone, smooth floors, and the sound of wind passing through sighing cracks. I climbed a spiral staircase. Each step sounded like a muffled drum. At the top, I reached the tower chamber, circular, empty, except for a clay basin at the center, dry but still marked by a white ring that time hadn't erased. I sat there for a while, I cannot measure, and for the first time in years, I cried without knowing why, as if the floor told me something my mind could not understand, but my body never forgot. I spent the night there, wrapped in my cloak, resting against the cold wall. There was no bed, no fire, but neither was there fear. It felt like sleeping in the womb of a memory, cradled by something ancient and too deep to name. At some point in the night, I heard a faint sound, nearly imperceptible, the distant sob of a baby from within the stone. I wasn't afraid. I simply closed my eyes more tightly and let that sound rock me like a forgotten lullaby. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight touched the white wall, it looked slightly damp, as if it had wept through the night. The light cut through the mist and reflected off the stones with a gentleness bordering the sacred. I descended in silence, not wishing to disturb whatever lived there. At the exit, I tied a ribbon of linen to the gate as a sign of respect, not from fear but from gratitude. Some places don't ask to be understood, only honored. And the white fortress, with all its silence and wounded tenderness, seemed to thank me with the soft breath of a maternal wind. I returned to the village with slow steps and a quieter heart. The locals looked at me in silence but asked nothing. They knew their stories needed no confirmation. It was enough to see the eyes of one who'd returned. An old woman simply nodded, as if recognizing someone who had touched the sacred. I shared bread with the villagers and drank fresh milk offered by a young farm girl. It never tasted so full. Since then, whenever sleep delays, I think of that place. Not for its tales, but for what cannot be seen. The gentle weight of a story woven with silence and sacrifice. There are castles built of glory, others of ambition. That one, hidden among moss and hills, was shaped by hands that never held swords, but held up the world in another way. Perhaps that's why it still stands. For some memories do not collapse. They simply rest, waiting to be heard by a clean heart. Sometimes I wonder if the castle is still there, or if it has returned to the earth. But deep down, I know it was never bound to stone alone. It lives in the memory of those who listened, in the milk spilled that never dried. I carry a shard of that wall with me, wrapped in linen cloth. Not as a relic, but as remembrance. That even the most solid structures are born from invisible gestures. And that is why, when sleep takes too long to arrive, I close my eyes and imagine myself again in that white tower, the wind slipping through the cracks, and the whole world hushed around me. I imagine the women who, nameless in the books, built a castle with their very bodies, and I let that memory cradle me. Perhaps tonight, as you rest your head, you too will hear the whisper of the white fortress, and may it bring peace. Good night, traveler. May your dreams be as gentle as warm milk at dawn.